Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: a war crime is still a war crime, even in retaliation. Israeli rabbis work around the clock, even on the Sabbath, to count the dead from Hamas attack. As Israeli invasion looms, diplomats seek to meet Gaza's dire human needs. Washington joins top 5 of college football's USLBM coaches poll, while USC tumbles. Leopard's purr is giving Ukraine's tank troops an element of surprise. A war crime is still a war crime, even in retaliation. The Sydney Morning Herald. This article discusses the recent violence in Israel and Palestine and the importance of adhering to international humanitarian law. The author argues that both sides have violated this law, with Hamas committing war crimes and Israel imposing an unlawful siege on Gaza. The author also criticizes Israel's targeting of civilian buildings and the high number of civilian casualties. The article concludes by stating that sympathy should be shown to both Israelis and Palestinians and that a military solution is not the answer to resolving this conflict. Israeli rabbis work around the clock, even on the Sabbath, to count the dead from Hamas attack. The Toronto Star. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers, women, and children have been gunned down by Hamas militants in Israel. The military rabbinate has been working around the clock to identify the bodies, with teams of reservists who spend their days in white hazmat suits. So far, only 50% of the bodies have been identified. Families have been flocking to hospitals to give DNA samples in the hope of a match. The process could take months as some bodies are so disfigured that they cannot be identified. As Israeli invasion looms, diplomats seek to meet Gaza's dire human needs. New York Times. Diplomats from various countries are working to ease the humanitarian crisis in Gaza as Israel prepares for a possible ground invasion. The United States is deploying a second aircraft carrier to the eastern Mediterranean amid fears of a wider war. The UN Secretary-General described the situation as being on the verge of the abyss. The US, Egypt, and other Middle Eastern countries are working to ease the blockade of Gaza, which has caused severe shortages of food, water, and other essentials. Israel has agreed to restore water to a pipeline serving a southern part of Gaza after days of acute water shortages. Israel has called up 360,000 military reservists as it prepares for a ground invasion of northern Gaza. The Israeli military has announced a path to safety for people in northern Gaza to move southward. The United Nations estimates that nearly 1 million people have been displaced in Gaza. Israel has dropped over 6,000 bombs across Gaza in the first week of fighting. The Palestinian Health Ministry reports that Israeli attacks have killed at least 2,670 people in Gaza. Israel says that of the 1,300 people killed by Hamas militants in Israel during an October 7 raid, at least 258 were Israeli soldiers. Egypt and China have criticized Israel's actions, with China calling on Israel to halt the collective punishment of the people of Gaza. Washington joins top 5 of college football's USLBM coaches poll, while USC tumbles. Yahoo! The Washington Huskies have moved up to the number 5 spot in the USLBM coaches poll after defeating Oregon. This is their first top 5 ranking since October 2017. The top 4 teams in the poll remain the same, with Georgia retaining the number 1 spot. Oregon slips to number 11, while USC tumbles 7 spots to number 16 after losing to Notre Dame. Air Force, Iowa, and Tulane make their debut in the poll. Washington State, Kentucky, and Kansas drop out. Leopard's purr is giving Ukraine's tank troops an element of surprise. Telegraph. Ukraine's 21st Separate Mechanized Infantry Brigade has been successful in ambushing Russian troops using German Leopard tanks supplied by NATO. The Leopard tanks are quieter than the old Soviet-era tanks that Ukraine had been using, allowing them to creep up on their enemies unnoticed. These tanks have been donated to Ukraine as part of their ongoing counteroffensive, and despite facing some criticism, the Leopard tanks are considered to be a better match against the Soviet-built tanks that make up the Russian arsenal. U.S. will tighten curbs on China's access to advanced chip tech. Bloomberg. The Biden administration plans to tighten restrictions on China's access to advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment in an effort to prevent the country from developing cutting-edge technology that could give it a military advantage. The new rules will refine and close loopholes from previous restrictions and will add Chinese chip design firms to a trade restriction list. Overseas manufacturers will need a U.S. license to fill orders from these companies. Additionally, controls on selling advanced chip-making equipment and graphics chips to Chinese firms will be strengthened. The administration will also impose additional checks on Chinese firms attempting to avoid restrictions by routing shipments and manufacturing elsewhere. The updated restrictions will be published early this week. Hundreds line Wonderland Road calling for a ceasefire in Hamas-Israeli war. CBC. Thousands of Londoners gathered in a busy London street to mourn the civilians killed in the Israel-Hamas war and call for a ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, where people are bracing for a full-scale invasion of Israeli forces. Demonstrators formed a human chain and silently waved the Palestinian flag, with many holding up signs that read "We stand for human rights." Officials said more than 3,800 people from both Israel and Gaza have been killed 8 days into the war that started after Hamas militants launched a deadly assault on Israel. Anti-Semitism alive and well on the streets of UK today. Telegraph. The author expresses concern over the recent pro-Palestinian march in London, where thousands of people chanted genocidal slogans calling for the destruction of Israel and the expulsion of its Jewish population. The author criticizes the silence and equivocation of public bodies, such as the BBC and the Football Association, in the face of recent acts of violence against Jews. The author argues that silence and apathy towards anti-Semitism allows it to flourish and compares it to the inaction of the majority during the Holocaust. The article concludes with a warning of the dangers of remaining silent in the face of anti-Semitism. A spooked and lonely Taiwan looks for new friends. BBC. Taiwan is looking to form new alliances as it seeks to protect itself from threats by China. The island has just 13 official diplomatic allies, down from the Cold War era when it had many more. The remaining allies are small and of little help in offering protection against China, which has a bigger economy and checkbook. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen has called for democratic countries to support the island and warned of authoritarian regimes rolling back freedom. The country is specifically looking to form alliances with Eastern European nations that are wary of Russia and have experienced life under authoritarian rule. Lithuania, for example, has allowed Taiwan to set up an office in Vilnius, despite opposition from China. Taiwan is also hoping to strengthen ties with the European Union. Ecuador votes to elect new president. Al Jazeera. Ecuadorians are voting for a new president, with a businessman and a leftist politician as the two main contenders. Voters are primarily concerned with the economy and rising crime rates. Businessman Daniel Noboa, the son of a banana magnate, has led recent polls, but his rival, Luisa González, a protege of former President Rafael Correa, is within the margin of error. González has pledged to reintroduce social spending and use $2.5 billion from international reserves to help the economy. Noboa has promised job creation, particularly for young people. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six from the 6 Degree World, here to bring you the latest news from across the globe. Today, we discuss the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, the efforts to ease the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the college football rankings, Ukraine's success in ambushing Russian troops, U.S. restrictions on China's access to advanced chip tech, calls for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war, the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK, Taiwan's search for new allies, and the Ecuadorian presidential election. Now, let's dive into these stories. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's important to remember that war crimes are war crimes, regardless of the reasons behind them. Both sides have violated international humanitarian law, with Hamas committing war crimes and Israel imposing an unlawful siege on Gaza. It's crucial to show sympathy to both Israelis and Palestinians and understand that a military solution is not the answer to resolving this conflict. Moving on, in the world of college football, the Washington Huskies have climbed to the number 5 spot in the USLBM coaches poll, while USC tumbles down the rankings after a loss to Notre Dame. It's always exciting to see how the rankings shift throughout the season, and the Huskies' rise is certainly worth celebrating. In a surprising turn of events, Ukraine's use of German Leopard tanks has given them an element of surprise in their fight against Russian troops. These tanks, donated by NATO, are quieter than the old Soviet-era tanks Ukraine had been using, allowing them to ambush their enemies undetected. It's a reminder that even small advantages can make a significant difference in warfare. Shifting gears to geopolitics, the US is tightening restrictions on China's access to advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment. This move aims to prevent China from gaining a military advantage through cutting-edge technology. It's a clear indication of the increasing tensions between the two superpowers and the US's efforts to maintain its technological advantage. On a more humanitarian note, thousands of Londoners gathered to call for a ceasefire and mourn the civilians killed in the Israel-Hamas war. It's heartening to see people coming together to stand for human rights and express their desire for peace in the midst of such a devastating conflict. Unfortunately, not all news is positive. The rise of anti-Semitism in the UK is deeply concerning. The recent pro-Palestinian march in London witnessed genocidal slogans and calls for the destruction of Israel. It's essential to address and condemn such acts of hatred, as silence and apathy only allow anti-Semitism to flourish. In Taiwan, the island is seeking new alliances to protect itself from threats by China. With only 13 official diplomatic allies, Taiwan is looking to strengthen ties with democratic countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe. This search for new friends highlights the importance of solidarity in the face of authoritarian regimes. Lastly, Ecuadorians are voting for a new president, with a businessman and a leftist politician as the main contenders. The economy and rising crime rates are the primary concerns for voters. It will be interesting to see the outcome of this election and the impact it will have on the country's future. That's all for today's news, folks. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you make of these stories? Do you have any questions or opinions? The floor is yours. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.